Elena Voss had learned, a long time ago, that the best thing she could do in a room full of people who didn't want her there was to simply keep moving. She adjusted the strap of her leather satchel, squared her shoulders, and walked through the great doors of Vaelhurst Keep, as if she had every right to be there. The hall was enormous, ceilings that disappeared into shadow, walls lined with dark stone and burning torches, long tables draped in deep red cloth. Hundreds of guests filled the space, all of them tall, all of them beautiful, in the way that wolves were beautiful, sharp and certain, like they had been carved from something harder than ordinary people. Elena was not a wolf. She was human. And in this room, on this night, that was the most obvious thing about her. She had been hired 6 days ago by the Human Diplomatic Office to serve as a translator for the Blood Moon Convergence, a ceremony held once every 10 years, where the leaders of all 7 wolf packs gathered at Vaelhurst Keep to renew their loyalty to the Alpha King. The royal translator had fallen ill. Elena was the only person available who spoke 3 of the old shifter dialects. She had not been invited because anyone wanted her there. She had been invited because no one else could do the job. She found her post near the side of the great dais and stood quietly, watching the hall fill. She did not speak to anyone. No one spoke to her. Then the woman in silver appeared. She was tall and elegant, moving through the crowd the way water moves around stone, effortlessly, leaving everything slightly rearranged in her wake. She walked past Elena without looking at her, and then her shoulder turned just slightly, just enough, and the glass in her hand tilted. Cold red wine poured across the front of Elena's blouse. Laughter burst from a small cluster of noblewomen nearby. Not loud, not ugly. It was refined laughter, the kind designed to sting cleanly and leave no visible mark. Elena looked down at her blouse, then she looked up. The woman in silver had already turned away, as if the whole thing had not happened, as if Elena were a piece of furniture that had inconveniently gotten in the way. One of the noblewomen leaned toward another and whispered something. The word human reached Elena's ears clearly. She pulled a cloth from her satchel, pressed it to the stain, and walked to her post. She had been poor before. She had been overlooked before. She had been laughed at before. None of those things had stopped her, and she did not intend to let them stop her tonight. The doors at the far end of the hall opened, and everything changed. The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent in a wave, starting from the back and rolling forward, like the sound was being pulled out of the air by something stronger than noise. Every person in the hall straightened. Some bowed their heads, others went completely still. King Caspian Vael walked in. Elena had heard descriptions of him, of course. Everyone in the 7 territories had heard descriptions of the Alpha King, his height, his coldness, the scar across his jaw that he had earned in the border war 8 years ago. People spoke of him as if he were less a person and more a force of nature, something you prepared for the way you prepared for a storm. Seeing him in person, she understood why. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in black with no ornamentation except the old iron ring on his right hand that marked his rank. His face was exactly as described, sharp angles, jaw set hard, eyes the color of winter sky. He moved through the room without hurry, and the room bent around him, every head turning, every conversation dying. His gaze swept the hall in one clean arc. Elena inclined her head respectfully. She did not bow dramatically, the way the noblewomen near her did, pressing their chins nearly to their chests. She gave the correct, formal acknowledgement, nothing more. When she looked up again, the king had already moved past. Goad. The first ceremony began within the hour. One by one, the representatives of each pack approached the dais and delivered their fealty address, a formal declaration spoken in the old tongue, the language of their ancestors, the language that bound the packs to their king by tradition and law. The royal interpreter stood to the left of the dais, translating each address into the common tongue for the human diplomats seated near the back. The Eastern Pack elder was the 5th to speak. He was a very old man, with a white beard and small, careful eyes, and he spoke in a dialect that Elena recognized immediately, Carith, one of the oldest forms of the old tongue, rarely used, rarely taught, considered by most modern scholars to be effectively extinct as a spoken language. The royal interpreter listened for 12 seconds, And then his face did something that every person in the hall noticed. It went blank. He did not know this dialect. The silence stretched. The elder waited patiently, his hands folded, his expression kind. The interpreter opened his mouth and then closed it again. A quiet discomfort moved through the room like a cold draft. Elena stepped forward. She did not ask for permission. She did not raise her hand or clear her throat or make any announcement. She simply stepped up beside the interpreter and began translating, her voice quiet and clear and precise. The elder's address came through cleanly, every word placed correctly, not a single pause. When she finished and stepped back, the hall was not looking at the elder anymore. From the dais, a low voice said something in a language she was not meant to hear, a private word directed at the commander standing to the king's right. But Elena had very good ears, and she understood the old tongue in 7 forms. The king had asked, "Who is she?" The commander had replied, "Human, hired as a translator. She has been here less than a week." A silence. Then, her name. Elena looked at her satchel and kept her face perfectly still. The banquet began. Elena was seated at the far end of the lowest table, next to the door that led to the kitchens. The seat was clearly chosen to communicate something. She sat in it anyway, ate the food that was brought to her, and watched the room. She noticed the way the wolf nobility moved, always aware of one another, always measuring rank in small, silent ways. She noticed the way the king sat at the head of the great table, without eating, watching his court with the same expression he had worn all evening, controlled, distant, giving nothing away. She also noticed the woman in silver making her way toward the lower table. Duchess Lyra Solon, Elena had learned her name by then, moved through the banquet hall like a woman who owned every room she entered. She arrived at Elena's table with 2 companions, and a smile so smooth it was almost beautiful. "I wanted to come and say welcome," the Duchess said, in the pleasant tone of someone who did not mean it. "It must be strange, being the only human here tonight." Elena set down her fork. She looked at Lyra calmly. "I imagine it is," she said, "though I suspect most of the people in this room have experienced being the only one of their kind somewhere. It tends to build character." Lyra's smile stayed perfectly in place. "How charming. Do all humans speak so freely?" "The ones with good grandmothers do," Elena said. One of the companions pressed her lips together. The other looked away. "Enjoy your evening," Lyra said, and turned. From the head of the room, behind the long stretch of candle-lit table and crystal and red cloth, a brief sound came, controlled, cut short almost before it began, a sound that might, in a different man, have been a laugh. Elena did not look up, but she felt it. An hour later, she made the mistake of stepping into the corridor alone. She had gone to find the diplomatic aide who had hired her, to deliver the notes she had taken during the translation. The corridor was dim and quiet, lit by wall torches spaced too far apart. She was almost at the aide's chamber when footsteps fell in behind her. The lord was young, red-faced from blood wine, and clearly under the impression that the rules that applied inside the hall did not apply out here. He stepped in front of her and said several things that Elena would not repeat to anyone, ever. His voice was too loud for a corridor. His confidence was the kind that comes from never having been told no. Elena did not scream. She did not plead. She had spent 4 years working in difficult places, traveling through territories where she was always the smallest person in the room, and her grandmother, a sharp, practical woman who had lived on the border all her life, had taught her exactly 2 things about handling situations like this. The first, stay calm. The second, pressure points. She applied the second. The Lord found himself against the wall, considerably less confident than he had been 30 seconds ago. Elena adjusted her satchel on her shoulder, nodded at him politely, and walked away. She turned the corner and stopped. The king was standing in the corridor. He had been there. He had seen. Elena looked at him. He looked at her. The silence between them was the kind that happens when 2 people realize, at the same moment, that they are seeing each other clearly. "You should have hit him harder," the king said. Elena let out a short breath. "I thought about it," she said. "I decided this was less paperwork." Something shifted in the king's expression. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. moving just beneath the surface before he locked it down again. He looked at her for one more moment, then turned and walked back toward the hall. Elena stood in the empty corridor and told herself her hands were not shaking. They were, slightly. She gripped her satchel strap and followed. It was the historian who noticed the medallion. Elena had worn it every day of her life since her grandmother placed it around her neck the week before she died. It was a small, round piece of very old metal, dark silver, etched with a mark that Elena had always assumed was a family symbol of some kind. A gift from a long time ago, her grandmother had said. Keep it close. It means more than you know. During the quiet moment between the banquet and the second ceremony, Elena's collar shifted, and the medallion swung free. An old wolf with silver hair and eyes that had seen several centuries of history crossed the room to her in a pace that should not have been possible for someone his age. He stopped in front of her and looked at the medallion with an expression that Elena could not read. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "My grandmother," she said. "She gave it to me before she died." "And her mother gave it to her," the historian said softly. It was not a question. He took it, very gently, with both hands, and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Elena. Then he turned and walked directly to the antechamber, where the king was preparing for the final ceremony. Elena stood where she was, uncertain whether to follow. She chose to wait. She waited for 11 minutes. Then Commander Reed appeared at the antechamber door and said, "The king asks that you come in." The antechamber was small and plainly furnished. A table, 2 chairs, a single window showing the blood moon rising large and red above the hills. Caspian stood at the window with his back to the door. The historian sat at the table, the medallion in his hands. Elena stood in the doorway until the king turned. He looked at her differently than he had all evening. Not softer. Caspian Vale was not a soft man, and she doubted he ever had been. But the calculation in his eyes had changed into something she could not quite name. He told her the history in plain, careful words. 3 generations ago, a young alpha from the Vale line had been wounded during a border crossing gone wrong. He had collapsed, alone, in the territory between the wolflands and the human settlements. A human woman had found him. She had not been afraid, and she had not run, and for 3 days she had hidden him and cared for him and kept him alive until his pack found him. She had asked for nothing in return. When his people tried to offer payment, she had refused. The alpha had given her the medallion instead, his family's mark. A symbol that carried one meaning in the old tradition. This person is owed a debt that cannot be measured. The debt had passed down through the Vale line. It had waited 3 generations for the person carrying that medallion to appear. Elena listened to all of this without speaking. When he finished, she looked at the medallion in the historian's hands and thought about her grandmother, small, practical, sharp-tongued, full of stories she had never quite finished, and felt something in her chest go very quiet. "She never told me," Elena said. "She may not have known the full story," the historian said gently. "She knew it was important. She made sure you kept it." Elena looked at the king. "What does this mean?" Caspian looked at her for a long moment. "Come to the ceremony," he said. "You will see." The blood moon was full overhead when the court assembled for the final time. Every noble wolf in the 7 territories stood in the great hall, arranged by rank, watching the dais where the king would make his announcement. The tradition was old. On the night of the blood moon convergence, the Alpha King named his chosen queen. The court had been waiting for 5 years. Tonight, the waiting would end. Duchess Lyra stood at the front of the crowd, composed and luminous, her silver gown catching the torchlight. She had been positioned there for an hour. She had prepared for this moment for longer than that. Caspian descended the dais steps and walked. He walked the full length of the hall, past the high nobility, past the pack elders, past Lyra, who did not move, whose expression did not change, but whose eyes followed him with a focus that was almost frightening. He stopped in front of Elena. She was still holding her satchel. She looked at him the way she had looked at him all evening, directly, without pretense, slightly uncertain whether this was a very formal mistake. He spoke in Carith. Only she understood every word. He told her that the medallion was real, the debt was real, and the old tradition was clear. He told her that he had spent 5 years refusing to name a queen because the right choice had not appeared, and he had always believed, in the cold, practical part of him that governed most of his decisions, that the right choice would not look like anything the court expected. Then he switched to the common tongue, so that every person in the hall could hear him clearly. "Elena Voss," he said, "I name you the future queen of the 7 Packs. Let anyone who disputes it speak now, or carry their silence as law." The hall was completely, absolutely still. Somewhere behind her, she heard a sound, the soft, controlled exhale of someone who had expected a different outcome. She did not turn to look. No one spoke. The silence went on for 10 full seconds, and then it became law. Elena stood in the great hall of Vaelhurst Keep, in a wine-stained blouse, with a leather satchel on her shoulder and an ancient medallion resting against her collarbone, and she did not cry, and she did not tremble, and she did not look at the people who had laughed at her earlier in the evening. She looked at the king, who was watching her with that expression she still could not entirely name, steady, certain, like a man who had just made a decision he intended to keep. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about 3 days in a border field, long ago, and a woman who had helped a stranger without asking for anything in return. She thought about the long, patient way that quiet things, kindness, dignity, worth, have of eventually finding their way to the surface. Then she straightened her back, the way she had been doing all her life, and she smiled. It was not a grand smile. It was small and real, and completely her own. And in the great hall of Vaelhurst Keep, surrounded by wolves who had laughed at a human girl only hours before, not a single one of them made a sound.